I am Kendra, 35 years old, and my family just served me a plate of absolute betrayal for the holidays. We were sitting around my parents' immaculate dining room table on Christmas Eve when my mother flashed her sweetest church smile and announced they were cutting me completely out of Granddaddy Earl's will. They expected me to break down crying to beg for my rightful place or to apologize for choosing my own independent path. Instead, I took a slow sip of my warm, spiced cider and smiled right back, because they had no idea what was sitting inside my designer tote bag, waiting to tear their entire world apart. Before I dive into exactly how I handled them, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the disrespect of toxic family members while quietly holding the winning hand. Growing up in my parents' household meant living in a museum where appearances mattered more than actual love. My mother Beatrice and my father Deacon Harold built their entire identities around their social standing, their country club memberships, and their flawless reputation at our church. Tonight was no different. The massive mahogany dining table groaned under the weight of a honey-baked ham, perfectly candied yams, and collard greens that smelled like generations of family recipes. The heavy crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier overhead, casting fractured rainbows across the expensive linen tablecloth. To an outsider, we looked like the absolute pinnacle of African American excellence. But the air in that room was so thick with unspoken resentments and silent judgments that it was hard to breathe. I sat quietly at the end of the table, absorbing the familiar chill of their conditional love. Across from me sat my younger sister Jasmine, 32 years old and forever the golden child of the family. She was dressed in a silk emerald gown, adjusting a diamond bracelet that she absolutely could not afford on her own. Next to her was her husband Preston. Preston was a 34-year-old white man who carried himself with the unearned confidence of a tech bro whose failures were constantly subsidized by other people. He spent the first half of the dinner aggressively checking his phone and loudly complaining about the venture capital market, while completely ignoring the food my mother had spent 2 days preparing. My parents, however, treated him like royalty, hanging on to his every word, as if he were the next billionaire genius. The main course was barely half eaten when my mother cleared her throat. She picked up her heavy silver fork and tapped it gently against her crystal wine glass, producing a sharp ringing sound that instantly silenced the room. The tension spiked immediately. She stood up, smoothing her immaculate dress, and plastered on that deeply concerning, practiced smile she usually reserved for the church hospitality committee. She talked about the blessings of the season, about gratitude, and about looking toward the future of our family lineage. Then, without missing a beat, she looked directly at me and announced that the family was making some necessary adjustments. She said that Granddaddy Earl's estate was going to be completely restructured for the betterment of the family's future. My father, Harold, folded his hands on the table and took over the conversation. His voice was deep and resonant, filled with the authority he loved to wield over everyone around him. He did not mince his words. He looked me dead in the eye and coldly delivered the blow. I was being cut out of the estate completely. Every single dime, every asset, every piece of property that my grandfather had built from the ground up would bypass me entirely. I felt the collective gaze of the table lock onto my face, waiting for the cracks to show. But I kept my expression perfectly neutral. Harold did not stop there. He leaned forward, using his deep voice to weaponize every choice I had ever made to establish my independence. He stated that because I was 35 years old, unmarried, and refusing to settle down into a traditional household, I lacked the stability required to manage generational wealth. He waved his hand dismissively at my career, referring to my premier corporate cybersecurity and forensic accounting firm as my little computer hobby. He said that leaving millions of dollars to a woman who wasted her time playing on laptops instead of building a proper family would be an insult to the legacy my grandfather left behind. He spoke to me as if I were a rebellious teenager who had just failed a math test, rather than a self-made woman who protected the digital infrastructure of major corporations. I listened without reacting. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my business or my life choices. I knew that arguing with a man committed to misunderstanding me was a complete waste of breath, but my silence only seemed to embolden the rest of the table. Preston eagerly jumped into the conversation, leaning across his plate with a condescending smirk. He aggressively mansplained basic business concepts to me, claiming that wealth preservation required bold moves. He boasted that his new app development startup was on the verge of massive disruption, but required serious capital to scale properly. According to Preston, family wealth needed to go to the visionaries who could exponentially grow it in the modern market, not to someone running a niche service business from a desk. It was laughable. Here was a man whose entire enterprise was bleeding cash, lecturing a forensic accountant on the principles of wealth building. I could see the arrogance radiating from him, completely blind to the reality of his own catastrophic failures. Then Jasmine chimed in, desperate to secure her position as the ultimate winner of this twisted family dynamic. She let out a soft, mocking laugh and looked at me with pure disdain. She told me that I should be grateful they even invited me to the dinner at all, considering how little I contributed to the family image. She adjusted her posture and stated that allowing me to sit at their holiday table was basically a charity act on their part, and that I should just sit quietly and appreciate the meal. The sheer audacity in the room was suffocating. They genuinely believed they held all the power. They believed they had effectively stripped me of my legacy, my worth, and my rightful place in the family. They were waiting for the tears to fall for me to storm out or to beg for a fraction of what was mine. Instead, I slowly picked up my crystal glass of warm spiced cider. The cinnamon and clove-scented steam curled into the air as I took a long, deliberate sip. I lowered the glass and smiled, a bright, genuine smile that clearly unsettled my mother. I shifted slightly in my chair, feeling the heavy, satisfying weight of my designer tote bag resting against my leg. Inside that bag was the absolute destruction of their entire reality, carefully documented, verified, and ready to be unleashed. My mother leaned back in her high-backed dining chair and clasped her hands together, resting them gracefully over her silk napkin. She tilted her head and offered me that sickeningly sweet look she spent decades perfecting for the church congregation. Her voice dripped with fake sympathy as she began to frame their greed as a spiritual lesson. She told me that wealth is a heavy burden and that God only places it on those truly prepared to carry it. According to Beatrice, the Lord had placed it heavily upon her heart to restructure the estate so that I could learn the holy virtue of humility. She had the absolute audacity to call my disinheritance a divine intervention. She claimed this financial cutoff was a blessing in disguise, designed to force me to stop playing business and finally seek out a strong husband who could provide for me properly. I kept my expression completely blank, watching her use religion to justify theft. But before the room could even process her twisted sermon, my father jumped right back in to support her. Harold pointed his silver steak knife at me, declaring that they had always tried to give me the absolute best, but I constantly rejected their guidance. He said my current situation was the direct result of my stubborn refusal to listen to my betters. Jasmine immediately seized the opening to elevate herself. She loudly reminded the table about her own life choices, comparing her supposed perfection to my perceived failures. She boasted about her lavish destination wedding in Santorini, making sure to emphasize the exclusive guest list and the 5-star luxury resort. She practically shouted about how our parents had gladly paid $250,000 for her perfect day because she respected the family image. She patted Preston's arm and told me that when you marry a man with a proper corporate vision, the family is happy to invest in your future. Preston nodded along, puffing out his chest as if his failing app made him the next tech billionaire. Then my mother brought up the ultimate sore spot, the one choice that still bruised her fragile country club ego. She sighed dramatically, lamenting my college education. She told the table how deeply I had embarrassed the family by rejecting a legacy admission to an Ivy League university. She said I threw away a spot at Harvard just to attend an HBCU on a full academic scholarship. To Beatrice, choosing a historically black college meant I was turning my back on the elite high society connections she valued above all else. She called my full ride a cheap, rebellious stunt, claiming I valued a free education over the prestigious networking that Jasmine and Preston had so carefully cultivated. The attacks came rapid fire, leaving no room for anyone else to breathe. Harold criticized my minimalist wardrobe, saying I dressed too aggressively for a woman trying to attract a man. Jasmine mocked my refusal to let our parents buy me a luxury condo downtown, suggesting I lived like a struggling college student just to prove a point. They threw every past decision in my face. Every time I chose independence over their financial control was weaponized as proof of my supposed dysfunction. They wanted me to break. They desperately wanted me to raise my voice, to slam my hands on the mahogany table, to give them the angry, erratic reaction they needed to justify cutting me out of the will. They needed me to play the loud, ungrateful scapegoat so they could comfortably play the righteous victims. They wanted to see the pain of rejection wash over my face, but I refused to give them the performance they paid for. I let them exhaust their breath. I let them list every perceived failure, every disappointment, every time I had chosen my own peace over their toxic expectations. I sat perfectly still, maintaining unwavering eye contact with my mother. I watched her holy facade begin to crack under my absolute silence. The more I did not react, the more desperate and loud their insults became. They were shouting at a brick wall, and the lack of emotional response from my end was driving them insane. I just took another slow sip of my cider, letting the sweet taste linger on my tongue. I was not going to fight for a seat at a table I was preparing to flip over. My father cleared his throat loudly, signaling the end of the verbal firing squad. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored velvet blazer and pulled out a plain white envelope. He placed his fingertips on the crisp paper and slid it slowly across the polished mahogany table until it stopped right next to my dinner plate. "We are not entirely heartless, Kendra," he stated, adjusting his gold cufflinks. "Your mother and I understand that life is challenging when you refuse to build a proper safety net. We know the holiday season can be financially stressful for independent contractors. We discussed it and decided we could not let you leave empty-handed tonight." I set my crystal glass down and picked up the envelope. I popped the unsealed flap and pulled out the contents. Sitting in the palm of my hand was a personal check written out for exactly $500 in my mother's extravagant cursive handwriting. Tucked neatly behind the check was a piece of cheap plastic. It was a $50 gift card to a mid-tier casual dining chain. Before I could even process the absolute comedy of the gesture, Preston leaned back in his chair and let out a loud, condescending chuckle. He crossed his arms over his expensive cashmere sweater and looked at me with pure, unadulterated pity. "Think of it as a little something to help with your rent, Kendra," he said, flashing his perfectly whitened teeth. "We know the economy is rough on small freelancers right now, especially in the tech sector where you are competing with real companies. Just consider it a small boost to keep your head above water until you figure things out. If you ever need advice on how to scale your little operation, my inbox is always open." Jasmine chimed in immediately, eager to back up her husband's arrogance. "Make sure you actually use the gift card for a hot meal," she instructed, waving her diamond-clad wrist in my direction. "Since you do not have a husband to take you to nice places, we wanted to make sure you at least got a decent dinner out of the holidays. Try not to spend the cash on silly computer parts. Maybe buy yourself a proper dress so you do not look so miserable next year." Beatrice nodded solemnly, pressing a manicured hand to her chest. "It is a blessing to be able to give back to those less fortunate," she declared, her voice carrying the cadence of a Sunday morning testimony. "Consider it our Christmas charity. We pray you use it wisely to get your life on track and find some stability." I stared down at the $500 check. It was a staggering level of disrespect. The amount written on that slip of paper was literally less than what I charged my corporate clients for 15 minutes of forensic consulting. The gift card was an even greater insult. They were looking at a woman who secured multi-million-dollar data infrastructures and offering her a chain restaurant appetizer as a lifeline. They genuinely believed I was a struggling, helpless charity case begging for scraps from their overflowing table. They wanted me to feel the sting of poverty. They wanted me to look at that tiny sum of money and feel absolute crushing gratitude for their benevolence. They were using a $500 check to purchase the right to demean me. I did not rip the check in half. I did not throw the plastic card across the room. I carefully slid both items back into the plain white envelope and tapped the edges against the table to align them perfectly. I set the envelope down next to my cider. I looked at Preston, taking in his smug posture and the expensive watch he was wearing, a watch I knew for a fact he bought using company funds. "How incredibly generous of you all," I said, my voice smooth and entirely devoid of sarcasm. "I will be sure to put this exactly where it belongs. I appreciate the deep concern for my financial well-being, Preston. It is always refreshing to get financial advice from someone who understands the weight of managing serious capital." Preston beamed completely, missing the icy undertone of my words. "Anytime, Kendra," he replied, taking a large bite of his ham. "It takes a village to lift up those who are struggling." I smiled back at him, letting the silence stretch for just a fraction of a second. They had set the stage perfectly. They had painted me as the impoverished failure, making my upcoming response completely justified. I let my hand drop from the table and rest on the leather strap of my tote bag. The consolation envelope sitting next to my plate was the final piece of evidence I needed to confirm that they felt absolutely zero remorse for their actions. They had dug their own graves, and they were proudly standing at the bottom, waiting for the dirt to fall. Jasmine watched me place the consolation envelope down on the table, her eyes narrowing. My calm acceptance was clearly not the reaction she craved. She needed a spectacle. She needed me to look as small as she firmly believed I was. She reached into her sequined clutch resting on the table and pulled out a thick folded piece of heavy cardstock. She flicked her wrist and tossed the paper directly onto my dinner plate. It landed with a soft thud right next to my half-eaten slice of ham. I glanced down. It was the itemized invoice from the luxury catering company my mother had hired for the evening. The total at the bottom was printed in bold black ink: $2,000 flat. "You know," Kendra Jasmine began, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "since Mom and Dad are officially restructuring the estate and cutting off the dead weight, it is only fair you actually contribute to the family for once." I looked up from the invoice, meeting her gaze. "Contribute?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly level. Jasmine smiled, flashing her expensive veneers. "Exactly. Preston and I are the future of this family. We are the ones carrying the legacy forward. You are just taking up space. So since you are not getting a single dime of Granddaddy Earl's money, paying for tonight is the absolute least you can do to earn your seat at this table. Consider it your admission ticket." The sheer unadulterated audacity of her demand hung in the air. She was actually asking me to fund the very dinner where my family ambushed and disinherited me. I looked over at my parents, expecting at least a shred of parental decency to intervene. Instead, Harold took a long, slow sip of his expensive Cabernet. Beatrice simply adjusted her pearl necklace and nodded in agreement. "Your sister makes a valid point, Kendra," my father stated, setting his glass down. "You have eaten the food. You have enjoyed the ambiance. It is time you started paying your own way in this world. Treating this family like a free ride ends tonight." Preston leaned over and tapped the invoice on my plate with his index finger, leaving a smudge on the pristine paper. "Just put it on a high-limit credit card, Kendra. You can pay it off in installments. That is what normal working-class people do, right?" They were entirely serious. They genuinely expected me to pick up the bill for their lavish holiday performance. The disrespect had reached a peak so profound it was almost beautiful. They had stripped away every last illusion of family loyalty, leaving nothing but raw, ugly greed. I stared at the four of them, my mother with her pious judgments, my father with his baseless arrogance, my sister with her desperate need to be superior, and her husband, a parasitic fraud wearing a suit paid for with stolen money. They had set the trap perfectly. They had cornered the scapegoat. They had delivered their final humiliating blow. They had fully and completely justified the avalanche I was about to unleash. I picked up the $2,000 catering invoice and placed it neatly on top of the consolation envelope. I smoothed the edges down, making sure the stack of disrespect was perfectly aligned. "You want me to pay for my seat at the table?" I asked, looking directly into Jasmine's eyes. She crossed her arms and lifted her chin. "It is the absolute bare minimum you can do." I nodded slowly. You are absolutely right, Jasmine. It is time we talk about who pays for what in this family. I pushed my chair back slightly, giving myself enough room to move. I reached my right hand down into my designer tote bag. My fingers brushed past my wallet and closed around the thick red legal folder waiting at the bottom. The gold ribbon binding it together felt smooth against my skin. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to tear the house down. I pulled the heavy folder from the depths of my bag and placed it squarely on the table. The deep red cover stood out starkly against the crisp white tablecloth. I picked up the catering invoice and the white envelope containing their insulting $500 check. With a flick of my wrist, I slid both items directly back to Jasmine. They glided across the polished wood and stopped right against the base of her water glass. "Keep your money, Jasmine," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, dangerous register. "You are going to need every single cent to cover what is coming." Jasmine scoffed, crossing her arms defensively. "What is that supposed to mean?" I ignored her and picked up the red folder. The gold ribbon binding it caught the light from the crystal chandelier above us. I held it out across the table, specifically targeting my brother-in-law. "Merry Christmas, Preston," I said. "I know how much you value serious capital and visionary business moves, so I decided to get you something that aligns perfectly with your entrepreneurial lifestyle." Preston leaned forward, a patronizing smile stretching across his face. He let out a short, amused breath as he reached out and took the folder from my hands. He looked at my parents, shaking his head slightly, as if indulging a petulant child throwing a holiday tantrum. "Oh, Kendra," he sighed, tapping his fingers against the thick cardstock. "You really did not have to go out of your way. I hope this is not another one of your little business proposals. I already told you my startup is operating on a level that your local accounting shop simply cannot process." I did not blink. "Just open it, Preston." He gave Jasmine a knowing, arrogant smirk, pulling the gold ribbon loose with a dramatic flourish. The ribbon fell to the table like a dead snake. He flipped open the heavy red cover. He looked down at the first page. It took exactly 4 seconds for his entire reality to fracture. I watched the transformation with absolute surgical precision. The smug, condescending smile completely vanished from his face, wiped away as if it had never existed. His skin, which had been flushed with expensive wine and arrogance, rapidly drained of all color. He suddenly looked like a ghost wrapped in a cashmere sweater. His eyes darted frantically across the bold black text at the top of the document. He blinked rapidly, reading the same paragraph twice, then 3 times. His hands began to tremble so violently that the thick pages audibly rattled against the mahogany dining table. "What is this?" he whispered, the sound barely escaping his throat. Harold frowned, setting down his wine glass. His authoritative posture shifted into genuine confusion. "What is it, Preston? What did she give you?" Preston could not answer. He was completely paralyzed. His eyes were locked on the seal at the bottom of the page, recognizing the official letterhead of the very venture capital firm that funded his entire existence. Jasmine leaned over, trying to catch a glimpse of the papers. "Preston, what is going on? What does it say?" Preston snapped the folder shut, slamming it against the table. He looked up at me, and for the first time in his life, there was absolute terror in his eyes. He swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming at his temple, despite the cool air conditioning blowing through the dining room. "How did you get this?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "This is confidential corporate data. This is classified." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table. I interlaced my fingers and looked right through him. "It is a comprehensive forensic audit," I stated clearly, ensuring every single person at the table heard me. "Commissioned directly by your lead investors. They noticed some rather alarming discrepancies in your quarterly burn rate. They wanted to know exactly where their 8-figure investment was disappearing to, since your revolutionary app still lacks a functioning prototype after 2 years of development." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. "Kendra, what on earth are you talking about? Stop harassing your brother-in-law immediately." I kept my eyes locked on Preston. He was breathing heavily, gripping the edge of the table as if the floor had just dropped out from under him. "Tell them, Preston." I challenged, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "Tell your adoring in-laws what my little computer hobby just uncovered." Preston opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. He glanced at my father, then back to me, his eyes darting frantically as his brain short-circuited, trying to find a lie big enough to cover the crater he was currently standing in. Harold slammed his hand flat against the table. The crystal glasses shook. "Kendra, I have had enough of these childish games," he barked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Explain what is in that folder immediately, or I will personally escort you out my front door. You do not come into my home on Christmas Eve and terrorize your sister's husband with fake documents." "Fake," I repeated. I let out a sharp laugh. "Dad, you have spent the last decade assuming I sit in a basement fixing broken keyboards because you never bothered to actually ask what I do for a living. You called it a computer hobby because diminishing my work made you feel better about my independence. So let me clear up the confusion right now." I stood up slowly, smoothing out the front of my dress. I looked down at my parents, making sure I had their undivided attention. "I do not run a computer hobby," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "I am the founder and lead director of a premier corporate cybersecurity and forensic accounting firm. We do not fix laptops. We trace stolen millions for Fortune 500 companies. We dismantle corporate fraud. We hunt down offshore accounts, and we build federal cases against executives who think they are smarter than the paper trail they leave behind." My mother stared at me, her jaw slightly open. She looked as though I had just started speaking a foreign language. "Forensic accounting," she whispered the words, sounding heavy on her tongue. "Yes, Mom, forensic accounting. And as it turns out, my firm is very well known in the venture capital sector." I turned my attention back to Preston, who was currently trying to sink into the upholstery of his dining chair. "In fact, my firm is so well known that 3 months ago, the lead investment group backing Preston's little app development startup reached out to me directly." Preston flinched. "That is a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You are lying. Vanguard Partners uses an internal audit team. They would never hire a third-party firm without notifying the CEO." I smiled, feeling a surge of pure adrenaline. They do notify the CEO, Preston, when the CEO is actually respected. But when the CEO is burning through seed money without producing a single line of viable code, the investors tend to get suspicious. They hired my firm through a blind shell company specifically so you would not know we were watching every single transaction you made. We have been inside your company's servers for 90 days. We tracked every wire transfer. We pulled every expense report. We recovered every deleted email. The dining room went entirely silent. It was a thick, suffocating silence. The kind of quiet that drops over a room right before a hurricane rips the roof off. The ambient holiday music playing softly from the kitchen speaker suddenly sounded absurdly loud. Jasmine looked from me to Preston, her perfectly contoured face twisting in confusion. "Preston, what is she talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What does she mean they tracked your wire transfers? Your app is launching next quarter. You told my parents the beta test was a massive success." Preston refused to look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the red folder on the table as if it might spontaneously combust and destroy the evidence inside. "Tell her, Preston," I commanded. "Tell your wife how successful the beta test was." He swallowed hard but remained completely mute. The arrogant tech visionary who had just spent the last hour giving me unsolicited financial advice was completely paralyzed by the truth. "Fine," I said, walking around to the side of the table. "I will tell her." I reached over and flipped the red folder back open. I pointed to the executive summary printed on the very first page. "There is no beta test, Jasmine," I announced, my voice echoing in the quiet room. "There is no app. The software developers Preston hired quit 6 months ago because he stopped paying their invoices. The revolutionary code he has been bragging about at your country club dinners does not exist. His entire company is a hollow shell operating entirely on fraudulent projections and falsified growth metrics." Harold stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "Now you listen here, Kendra. he boomed, trying to regain control of his house. "I am a deacon in the church and a respected businessman." I reviewed Preston's prospectus myself when he founded this company. He had a solid business plan. "You are fabricating this narrative because you are bitter about the will." I turned to face my father, my posture rigid. "You reviewed a piece of paper, Dad. You looked at a glossy slideshow filled with tech buzzwords, and you believed it because a white man in a cashmere sweater handed it to you. You were so desperate to have a visionary son-in-law that you did not even bother to verify his claims. You did not look at his back-end server data. You did not check the IP addresses of his supposed active users. But I did. I tapped the red folder again. The data does not lie. Preston's startup is a complete failure. But that is not even the worst part. Failing in business is common. It happens every day. What does not happen every day is a CEO systematically siphoning off millions of dollars of investor capital to fund a luxury lifestyle he cannot afford. The silence in the room deepened, transitioning from shock to absolute terror. My mother pressed a napkin against her mouth, her eyes wide with dread. She was slowly realizing that the pristine social image she worshipped was about to be burned to ash. Preston finally found his voice, though it was weak and shaking. "You have no proof," he stammered. "It is all business expenses, client acquisition costs, networking." I did not even raise my voice. I did not need to. The facts were loud enough. "Do not play semantics with a forensic accountant, Preston," I said, stepping closer to him. "You categorized a $40,000 private jet charter to Cabo as a client acquisition cost. We pulled the flight manifest. There were no clients on that plane. It was just you and Jasmine. You categorized a $60,000 jewelry purchase as a corporate gifting expense. We traced the serial numbers. Those diamonds are currently sitting around your wife's wrist." Jasmine instinctively pulled her arm back, hiding her diamond bracelet beneath the table. She looked at her husband, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. "This is not happening," Beatrice whispered, shaking her head in denial. "Lord Jesus, this cannot be happening. My family does not associate with thieves." "Oh, it is happening, Mom," I said, keeping my focus sharp, "and it gets much worse." I turned the page in the heavy red folder. The crisp sound of the paper slicing through the tension was deafening. I looked directly at Preston, who was now sweating through his expensive cashmere sweater. "Let us talk about the bridge loans, Preston," I said, my voice cutting straight through his rising panic. "You secured a $2 million loan on March 14th using completely forged revenue projections. When that money evaporated into your personal accounts by August, you went to a secondary lender. You took out another $2 million on September 2nd. You are currently sitting on exactly $4.2 million of highly leveraged corporate debt. And because you are arrogant enough to think you would never get caught, you personally guaranteed both of those loans." Preston slammed his hands down on the mahogany table. The silverware rattled against the fine china. "You do not understand venture debt," he shouted, his voice cracking like a terrified teenager. "It is a standard runway extension. All tech startups operate in the red before their Series B round. You are twisting standard accounting practices to make me look bad." I did not even blink. I talked right over him, projecting my voice to command the entire room. "Startups operate in the red because they are paying engineers to build a product, Preston. They do not operate in the red because the CEO is funneling $500,000 to a shell company in the Cayman Islands to cover his sports gambling losses." Jasmine whipped her head toward her husband so fast her expensive silk braids whipped across her shoulder. Gambling, she shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical register. "Preston, what is she talking about? You told me that offshore account was a tax shelter for our real estate investments. You told me our accountant recommended it." "He lied, Jasmine," I stated flatly, keeping my eyes locked on Preston. "He lied to you. He lied to his board of directors. He lied to his investors. And he lied to the federal government. On October 12th, he wired $250,000 to a sports book in Macau. On November 9th, he wired another $150,000. He has been using investor capital to play high-stakes poker overseas while telling you he was at global tech conferences. Preston lunged forward, reaching across the holiday ham to grab the red folder from my hands. I snatched it back smoothly, sliding it just out of his reach. "Do not touch my property," I warned, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "You are already facing federal wire fraud charges, Preston. Do not add assault to the list." Harold stood up abruptly, his napkin falling from his lap to the floor. His authoritative posture had completely dissolved into frantic desperation. He pointed a trembling finger at his son-in-law. "Preston, look at me," he commanded. "Is she telling the truth? Tell me right now that this bitter girl is making this up. Tell me you did not gamble away investor money." Preston looked at my father, and the last shred of his arrogant tech bro facade crumbled into dust. He sank back into his chair, dragging his hands over his pale face. "Harold, listen to me," he stammered, the smooth corporate confidence entirely gone from his voice. "It is just a temporary cash flow issue. I can fix it. I had a bad run at the tables, but my system works. I just need a short-term capital injection to cover the margins before the audit becomes public. I can make it all back." I laughed, a cold, sharp sound that echoed in the dining room. "There is no fixing this, Preston. The capital is gone. The investors are pulling their backing on Monday morning. They have already drafted the referral to the Securities and Exchange Commission. By New Year's Day, you will be sitting in an interrogation room answering questions from federal agents about why your corporate accounts are completely drained." Jasmine grabbed the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white, but the cars, she whispered, her breath hitching as she looked down at her diamond bracelet. "The house in the hills. We just signed the lease on the new Mercedes last week." "Repossessed," I stated, delivering the facts without a single ounce of pity. "All of it. Because Preston used the company as collateral for everything. Your entire aesthetic, Jasmine, your entire luxury lifestyle is built on a mountain of federal fraud. You do not own a single thing in your house. The bank owns it all, and they are coming to collect the moment the market opens on Monday." Beatrice pressed both hands to her face, letting out a muffled sob. The shame was already breaking her. The realization that her golden child and her perfect white son-in-law were about to be splashed across the evening news for embezzlement was a fate worse than death for a woman obsessed with country club status. "You wanted a visionary dad," I said, turning my attention back to Harold. "You wanted a brilliant businessman who could exponentially grow the family wealth. You sat at this table and told me my career was a little hobby while you put this con artist on a pedestal. You blindly trusted him because he wore a nice suit and threw around buzzwords you did not even understand." Preston suddenly looked up, his eyes wide with a desperate, frantic energy. He turned to my father, completely ignoring my presence. "Harold, you have to help me," he pleaded, gripping the edge of the table. "You have liquidity. We can leverage the family estate. Granddaddy Earl's trust can easily cover a $4 million debt. We just need to pay back the principal before the investors go to the SEC. If we make them whole, they will drop the audit. We can keep this quiet. We can save the family reputation." The absolute unmitigated nerve of this man to sit at my parents' table and ask my father to drain our family generational wealth to cover his criminal gambling debts. He was perfectly willing to bankrupt my parents to save his own skin. But I was not even angry. I was thrilled, because Preston, in his blind panic, had just handed me the absolute perfect transition for my next gift. I shifted my focus from the sweating, desperate man across the table and locked eyes with my sister. Jasmine was breathing shallowly, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly her knuckles were white. She looked at Preston as if he had suddenly morphed into a stranger. But I was not done tearing down the facade. Preston had gambled away a fortune, but he did not burn through $4 million entirely on his own. "You want to leverage Granddaddy Earl's trust to save yourself, Preston?" I asked, keeping my tone dangerously calm. "You think the family should bail you out? Let us talk about where the rest of that venture capital went, because it was not all lost at the baccarat tables in Macau." Jasmine flinched at the sound of my voice. I leveled my gaze at her, making sure she felt the full weight of the truth. "You see, Jasmine, when I audited his shell companies, I noticed a fascinating pattern of disbursements. Every single time you posted a new luxury unboxing video on your social media timeline, There was a corresponding wire transfer from the corporate development fund. She shook her head rapidly, her heavy silk braids swinging. "No," she stammered. "My husband is a successful tech founder. He has an executive salary. He buys me those gifts from his personal accounts." I let out a harsh laugh that echoed off the dining room walls. "He pays himself a salary of zero, Jasmine, because the company generates absolutely zero revenue. There is no personal account. It is all stolen. That limited edition crocodile Birkin bag you brought to Sunday service last month, just to make the other women in the congregation jealous. That was paid for with a Series A investor draw designated for back-end server maintenance." Jasmine gasped, pulling her arms off the table as if the very surface was burning her. I kept going, relentless and precise. "The matching Mercedes coupes sitting in your driveway right now. Those exorbitant monthly lease payments are pulled directly from the employee payroll account. The 2 weeks you spent in a private overwater bungalow in the Maldives for your anniversary. That was booked using the corporate marketing budget. Your entire aesthetic, your whole superior personality, your entire high society identity is funded by federal wire fraud." The air in the room grew suffocatingly thin. Jasmine looked at Preston, her eyes wide and pleading for him to deny it. She waited for him to call me a liar, to pull out some financial document that proved I was just a bitter, jealous sister. But Preston could not even look at her. He kept his head bowed, staring at his empty dinner plate, while his pristine corporate image burned to the ground. The golden couple was nothing but a pair of high-end thieves. Jasmine let out a choked sob. The reality of her situation was finally crashing down on her. She was wearing stolen diamonds. She was carrying stolen bags. She was an accessory to a multi-million-dollar federal crime. She whipped her head toward our parents, her perfectly contoured face twisting in absolute panic. "Mom, Dad," she cried, her voice pitching into a hysterical shriek. "You have to do something. You have to fix this. They are going to take my things. They are going to arrest him. Dad, you have to give him the money from the trust." Beatrice was hyperventilating, clutching her pearl necklace as if it could shield her from the incoming disgrace. She looked at my father with wild, terrified eyes. "Harold, we have to help them," she pleaded, her voice shaking with the fear of public ruin. "We cannot let Jasmine go to prison. We cannot let the country club or the church find out our son-in-law is a criminal. Write him a check, Harold. We have to cover the debt right now before the investors go to the authorities." Harold opened his mouth to speak, but his face was ashen. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, watching the ground crumble beneath his expensive Italian loafers. I reached out and placed my hand flat on the thick red folder, closing it with a sharp, definitive snap. "Nobody is writing a check, Mom," I declared, shutting down her delusion instantly. "Because writing a multi-million-dollar check to cover up federal embezzlement makes you an accessory after the fact. The feds do not care about your country club reputation, Beatrice. They only care about the money trail. And furthermore, Dad could not write that check even if he wanted to." My parents froze. Harold slowly turned his head to look at me, the desperation in his eyes replaced by a new, terrifying confusion. "What do you mean I cannot write the check?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I smiled, feeling the absolute thrill of the next stage of my plan. I reached back into my designer tote bag. It was time for the second Christmas gift. My hand was still resting inside my tote bag when my mother finally snapped. The sheer weight of the truth I had just dropped on the table was too heavy for her fragile social ego to carry, so she did what she had always done. She attacked me. Beatrice stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me, her face twisted with a level of malice she usually reserved for the devil himself. "You are a liar, Kendra," she spat, her voice vibrating with pure rage. "You are nothing but a jealous, bitter spinster who cannot stand to see her younger sister thriving. You sit alone in your apartment every night, stewing in your own misery, and now you are fabricating federal documents just to ruin Jasmine's happiness." I did not pull my hand out of my bag. I just watched her unravel. She was actually choosing to defend a man who had stolen millions of dollars over the daughter who had just warned her about a federal investigation. "You have always hated Preston," my mother continued, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "You have always been envious of the life he gave Jasmine. Because you know deep down that no man of his caliber would ever look twice at a woman as cold and stubborn as you. So you printed out some fake spreadsheets to destroy the only successful couple in this family. It is pathetic, Kendra. You are pathetic. Jasmine nodded fiercely, wiping away her mascara-stained tears. She is right, she sniffed, clinging to her mother's delusion like a life raft. Preston would never do those things. You made all of this up because you want me to be as miserable as you are. I let my eyes shift from my mother to my sister and finally to my father. Harold had been silent for exactly 10 seconds too long. I could see the gears turning in his head. He knew the documents were real. He was a businessman. He recognized legitimate venture capital letterheads and banking routing numbers. But admitting Preston was a fraud meant admitting he had been conned by a slick pitch. It meant his own judgment was flawed. And Deacon Harold never admitted to being wrong. Harold slammed both of his hands flat on the table, causing the silverware to jump. He stood up, drawing himself to his full height, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate me, the way he did when I was a teenager. He leaned across the honey-baked ham and thrust his index finger directly into my face. "You listen to me, and you listen to me carefully," he bellowed, his chest heaving. "You do not come into my home on the eve of our Lord's birth and threaten this family. You do not bring forged papers into my dining room to terrorize my son-in-law." I kept my posture completely relaxed. "I am not threatening anyone, Dad. I am delivering facts. If you choose to ignore them, that is your own funeral." "I am telling you to shut your mouth!" Harold roared, a vein bulging prominently in his neck. "You are out of line, Kendra. You have crossed a boundary that you cannot come back from. I will not have my daughter's marriage sabotaged by a bitter woman throwing a tantrum over an inheritance she does not even deserve." He pulled his cell phone from his blazer pocket and held it up like a weapon. "If you do not pack up your little fake folders and walk out my front door this exact second, I will dial 911. He threatened, his voice shaking with absolute fury. "I will tell the police that you are trespassing. I will have you escorted off my property in handcuffs for threatening this family. You are in my house, Kendra. You live by my rules or you do not step foot on my property ever again. Do you understand me?" The sheer delusion was almost suffocating. He was fully prepared to call armed police officers on his own flesh and blood daughter to protect a man who was actively draining investor capital to pay for sports gambling. He was willing to have me arrested to protect the illusion of his perfect life. I looked at the phone in his hand. Then I looked at the extravagant crystal chandelier hanging above us. I took in the expensive custom drapes, the imported rug beneath my feet, and the polished mahogany table that had hosted decades of their toxic performances. "Your house?" I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. "Yes, my house," Harold shouted, taking a step around the table toward me. "Bought and paid for with my sweat and blood. Now get out before I have you thrown out." I smiled, a slow, chilling smile that made my father freeze in his tracks. I finally pulled my hand out of my designer tote bag. I was holding the second gift wrapped meticulously in shiny silver paper. I placed the silver box on the mahogany table right next to the honey-baked ham. The wrapping paper caught the light from the chandelier, gleaming like a polished blade. I pushed it forward with one finger. It glided across the smooth wood and bumped gently against the base of my father's wine glass. "Go ahead, Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Since we are establishing the rules of who owns what and who gets to throw who out, I figured we should look at the actual paperwork. Open your present." Harold glared at me. The cell phone was still gripped tightly in his right hand, but his thumb had moved away from the keypad. He was a proud man who hated being challenged, but he was also a man who fundamentally feared the unknown. He knew my confidence was not a bluff. His chest heaving with lingering anger, he slowly lowered the phone and reached for the silver package. "Do not open that!" "Harold," my mother hissed, her voice sharp with panic. "She is just trying to distract you. Call the police. I want her removed." But Harold could not resist. His curiosity and his desperate need to prove me wrong completely overrode my mother's demands. He set his phone on the table and grabbed the silver box. He ripped the shiny paper off with sharp, aggressive tears, tossing the shredded pieces onto the floor. He lifted the lid of the plain cardboard box underneath, and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents clamped together with a heavy black binder clip. He stared at the first page. I watched the exact second his bravado completely shattered. It was a physical transformation. The rigid, authoritative posture he had maintained for 35 years collapsed in an instant. His shoulders slumped forward. The deep brown of his skin turned to a sickly ashen gray. His hands, the same hands that had just pointed furiously in my face, began to shake so violently that the heavy legal paper rattled against his expensive gold cufflinks. "What is this?" He whispered, the words catching in his throat. Jasmine leaned over, trying to read the text. Beatrice grabbed my father's arm. "Harold, what is it? What did she give you?" He did not answer her. He could not. He was too busy reading the county seals, the notary stamps, and the bold financial figures printed across the top sheet. He flipped to the second page, his eyes scanning the banking routing numbers and the official transfer of liability notices. Every single piece of paper in his shaking hands was a nail in the coffin of his perfect country club life. I stepped back from the table and crossed my arms. "Those are official county property deeds, Dad," I stated, clearly cutting through the heavy silence of the dining room. "Attached to them are the corresponding bank transfers and the legal assignment of debt forms. Notice the seal at the bottom of the first page. That is from the exact same bank you used to finance this beautiful, sprawling estate." Beatrice let out a breathy, nervous sound. "We own this house," she declared, though she sounded like she was trying to convince herself. "We paid off the mortgage 5 years ago. We hosted the mortgage burning party right in this very room." "You did pay off the first mortgage, Mom," I confirmed, giving her a tight smile. "But you did not pay off the second one." My mother froze. She looked at Harold, her eyes wide with sudden terror. "Harold, what second mortgage?" Harold squeezed his eyes shut, bowing his head. The legal documents slipped from his trembling fingers and scattered across the table, mingling with the scattered silver wrapping paper. I did not wait for him to explain. I took control of the narrative, ensuring every single person in the room understood exactly how far the deception went. 2 years ago, I said, projecting my voice, so it bounced off the high ceiling, "I noticed a massive shift in your financial profiles during a routine check. You see, Dad, while you were busy telling me my career was a joke, you forgot that my firm runs digital security for the very financial institutions holding your accounts." I did not even have to look hard. The warning flags tripped automatically. I pointed to the papers scattered in front of him. "You took out a massive second mortgage on this property. You leveraged the entire equity of this estate. And you did it quietly so the church congregation and your golf buddies would never find out that you were bleeding cash." Jasmine pressed her hands over her mouth, her eyes darting between me and our father. "But why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that?" I looked right at Preston, who was still sitting frozen in his chair, his own financial ruin already laid bare. "Because they had to bail out your husband, Jasmine," I revealed, dropping the hammer. 2 years ago, before this current app development scam, Preston got caught in an undisclosed lawsuit. He misappropriated funds from his previous employer, and they threatened to press federal charges. Dad and Mom took out a second mortgage on this house to quietly settle the lawsuit out of court. They leveraged their entire retirement to keep their golden son-in-law out of federal prison. Beatrice let out a sharp cry, pressing a napkin to her mouth. She looked at Preston with absolute horror, finally realizing that the man she had worshipped was the very anchor dragging them to the bottom of the ocean. "But that is not the end of the story." I continued, refusing to let them breathe. "Because Preston never paid you back, did he, Dad? He promised he would return the money as soon as his new startup secured funding, but he blew that funding on sports gambling and luxury leases. And because he never paid you back, you defaulted on the second mortgage." Harold kept his head bowed, staring blindly at the honey-baked ham. His silence was the loudest confession in the room. 3 months ago, I stated the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. You were 30 days away from the bank chaining the front doors and auctioning this pristine estate off to the highest bidder. You were about to be put out on the street right before the holidays. "No," Beatrice wailed, shaking her head violently. "No, that is impossible. We would have known. We would have received letters." "You did receive letters, Mom," I said. "Dad just intercepted the mail. He hid the notices because he was too proud to admit he had bankrupted the family to save a con artist. I walked slowly around the table, stopping right behind my father's chair. I looked down at the scattered deeds and banking documents. But the bank never auctioned the house. I explained, my voice perfectly calm against the backdrop of their absolute panic. Because the bank sold the distressed debt. They sold the entire second mortgage to a private blind LLC. That LLC paid off the arrears in full, assuming complete ownership of the debt and the underlying asset. I reached over my father's shoulder and tapped the top document on the table. Look at the name of the managing director of that LLC, Dad. Read it out loud for the table. Harold squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head weakly. Read it, I commanded, my voice cracking like a whip. Harold opened his eyes. He looked down at the official county document. His voice was nothing but a raspy whisper when he spoke. Kendra, he breathed out. I smiled, looking around the devastated dining room. That is right, I said. I bought the debt. I own the mortgage, which means I own the walls you are standing in, the roof over your head, and the mahogany table we are eating on. You do not own this house, Dad. I do, and you are officially 3 months behind on rent. The silence in the dining room was so absolute, I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Harold stared at me, his chest barely moving. Beatrice gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles white, as she struggled to comprehend that her entire high society identity had just been repossessed by the daughter she despised. I walked back to my chair and stood behind it, resting my hands on the high wooden back. I was not finished. You see, buying the debt gave me full access to the original loan application. I saw exactly what you submitted to the bank, Dad. I saw the falsified income statements. I saw the inflated appraisals. You did not just take out a second mortgage to save this white man from federal prison. You committed financial fraud to secure the funds. Harold flinched, his eyes darting toward the windows as if the authorities were already pulling into the driveway. You told the bank you were using the capital for home renovations? I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy air. But I tracked the disbursement. The money did not go to a contractor. It was wired directly to a corporate mediation firm in Silicon Valley. $2.5 million transferred on a Tuesday morning to quietly settle a massive intellectual property theft lawsuit against Preston. He did not leave his last company to start a new venture, Jasmine. He was forced out because he stole proprietary source code from his own co-founders. They threatened to hand the evidence over to the Department of Justice unless he paid them off. Jasmine whipped her head toward Preston, her mouth hanging open. You told me you bought them out, she shrieked, her voice cracking. You said they lacked your vision, so you bought their shares. He is a con artist, Jasmine, I stated flatly. He has never had an original idea in his life. He stole from his partners, he stole from his current investors, and he stole your parents' retirement. And the saddest part is that Mom and Dad knew exactly what he was. They read the settlement documents. They knew he was a thief, but they signed the mortgage papers anyway. They risked the roof over their own heads because admitting that the golden child married a fraud would have ruined their reputation at the country club. Beatrice began to weep openly. Large, ugly tears streamed down her perfectly powdered cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She reached a shaking hand out toward my father. Harold, tell her it is not true. She begged, her voice thick with desperation. Tell her we are going to fix this. Tell her we still own our home. Harold could not look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, utterly defeated. He knew there was no fixing this. I held all the cards. I owned the board. You missed your first payment in October, I said, pulling the timeline completely into the light. You called Preston begging him for the repayment he promised. But Preston ignored your calls because he was busy losing $500,000 at a baccarat table in Macau. You drained your savings to cover November. By December, you were completely tapped out. You were sitting in church every Sunday, smiling and shaking hands with the congregation, while secretly terrified that the bank was going to post an eviction notice on your front door. I picked up my glass of spiced cider and took another slow sip. I let them sit in the misery of their own making. They had sacrificed their financial security, their ethics, and their home to protect a man who was actively destroying them. You thought you were buying a legacy, Dad, I said, setting the glass down. You thought you were investing in a tech visionary who would elevate the family name. Instead, you bought a parasite. And you paid for him with the very house I grew up in. Jasmine suddenly slammed both of her hands onto the table. The plates rattled loudly. She stood up, pushing her chair back with such force it tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor. Her face was contorted with a mixture of terror and absolute rage. "It does not matter," she screamed, her voice echoing shrilly across the room. "It does not matter what you bought, Kendra." I raised an eyebrow, watching my sister lose her grip on reality. "It matters quite a bit, Jasmine, considering I can legally have the sheriff remove your parents from this property on Monday morning." "No, you cannot," Jasmine yelled, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You think you are so smart. You think you hold all the power because you bought some bank debt. But you are forgetting the entire reason we are sitting at this table. You are forgetting what Mom and Dad just announced." Beatrice looked up, a sudden spark of desperate hope igniting in her tear-filled eyes. She wiped her face and nodded furiously. "The will," she gasped, her voice trembling with renewed energy. "Granddaddy Earl's will." Jasmine laughed, a frantic, breathless sound. "Exactly. Tomorrow morning, Granddaddy Earl's estate clears probate. The family trust gets fully funded. There is more than enough liquid cash in those accounts to pay off the mortgage and clear Preston's debts. We will buy the house back from you. We will pay off the investors. We will fix everything. And because Mom and Dad just cut you out of the will, you will not get a single red cent of that money." Preston sat up straighter, grabbing onto Jasmine's delusion like a drowning man catching a life preserver. He ran a hand through his hair, nodding quickly. "Yes," he stammered. "The estate capital. We just need a bridge until the probate clears. Harold, we can use the estate funds to cover the venture debt. The SEC will not get involved if the investors are made whole." They were actually comforting each other. They were standing in the middle of a burning building, congratulating themselves on finding a bucket of gasoline. They truly believed that my grandfather's hard-earned logistics empire was going to be their personal slush fund. They believed they could use generational wealth built by a hard-working black man to bail out a white corporate thief. I looked at the four of them clinging to this pathetic fantasy. I felt a genuine smile spread across my face. It was not a cold smile. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated anticipation. "You are going to use Granddaddy Earl's money to pay me off?" I asked, my tone light and conversational. "Every single penny of the debt," Jasmine declared, lifting her chin with that familiar, arrogant entitlement. "You are going to get your money back, Kendra, and then you are going to get out of our lives forever. We do not need you. We have the family empire." I let out a soft chuckle. I reached into my designer tote bag one last time. My fingers brushed against the smooth, cool surface of a black velvet box resting at the very bottom. I pulled the box out and placed it gently on the table right next to the silver wrapping paper. "That is a fascinating financial strategy, Jasmine," I said. "There is just one massive, catastrophic problem with your business plan." I opened the black velvet box. Inside, resting on the dark fabric, was a polished silver flash drive and a stack of heavily notarized legal documents folded perfectly into a thick square. I pulled the papers out and laid them flat on the table right next to the property deeds and the catering invoice. Granddaddy Earl was a lot of things. I began, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. He was a self-made logistics mogul. He was a proud black man who built a generational empire during an era when banks would not even look him in the eye. But above all else, Granddaddy Earl was not stupid. My father stiffened. The mention of my grandfather's name seemed to physically strike him. Harold had always lived in the shadow of Earl's massive success, desperate to prove he was an equal businessman. "He watched you, Dad." I continued, keeping my gaze locked on my father. "For the last 6 months of his life, he watched everything. He saw you take out that secret second mortgage. He saw Preston bleeding cash and posting luxury vacations while his startup produced absolutely zero software. He saw Mom treating the church treasury like her personal piggy bank to maintain her country club status. He saw exactly what kind of people were sitting around his holiday table. Jasmine shook her head, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. "That is a lie," she snapped, her voice trembling. "The estate lawyers read us the will after the funeral. The entire logistics company and the real estate portfolio go to the family trust. Mom and Dad control the trust. We are getting that money tomorrow." I looked at my sister with pure, unadulterated pity. "The lawyers read you exactly what Granddaddy Earl paid them to read you, Jasmine. He set up a decoy trust specifically to keep you all comfortable and quiet while he handled his actual business." I tapped my index finger against the notarized papers on the table. 82 days before he passed away, Granddaddy Earl executed an ironclad, irrevocable legal transfer, I revealed, delivering the fatal strike. He did not leave his logistics empire to the family trust. He knew you were financially incompetent, Dad. He knew Preston was a grifter. He knew that if he left his liquid assets and his voting shares in your control, the three of you would bankrupt his entire life's work in under 5 years. Beatrice gasped, clutching the edge of the table as if the floor was giving way beneath her. "Harold, what is she saying?" she pleaded, her voice thin and reedy. "What does that mean?" "It means Mom," I said, turning my attention to her, "that Granddaddy Earl transferred 100% of the voting shares, the commercial real estate portfolio, and all liquid capital directly to me. I am the sole owner of the holding company. I control the board. I control the accounts. I am the empire." Preston let out a strangled, choking sound. The realization hit him like a freight train. The massive bailout he had been banking on, the millions of dollars he thought would save him from federal prison, had just vanished into thin air. He slumped forward, resting his head in his hands, his pristine corporate facade completely destroyed. Harold stared at the documents, his eyes wide and unblinking. "You forged this," he whispered, the denial spilling from his lips like a dying reflex. "You fabricated this transfer to steal my birthright." "I did not forge anything, Dad. The documents are authenticated by the Federal Registry, and the flash drive in that box contains a high-definition video of Granddaddy Earl signing the transfer while completing a psychological evaluation to prove he was of sound mind. His own medical team and 3 independent attorneys are in the video witnessing the signature. You cannot contest it. You cannot sue me for it. It is done. It has been done for months." Jasmine let out a loud, hysterical sob. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, ruining her expensive makeup. "But the will," she wailed. "Mom and Dad are in the will. We cut you out tonight. You are not getting anything." I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. I leaned across the table, bracing my hands on the polished mahogany. "You cut me out of a dummy document, Jasmine," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, chilling whisper. "That will you are so proudly relying on to clear probate tomorrow morning is attached to a ghost account. I checked the balance right before I walked into this house tonight. There is exactly $412 left in that family trust. It is just enough to cover the legal filing fees to close the account out completely." Beatrice let out a long, horrified wail. She collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands as the absolute totality of their ruin crashed down upon her. They had no money, they had no house, they had a mountain of federal debt and a son-in-law heading straight for a criminal indictment. I stood up straight, looking down at my mother, who was now openly weeping into her silk napkin. "You did not cut me out of the will, Mom," I declared, delivering the final masterstroke. "You just cut yourselves out of my empire." The dining room descended into absolute chaos. Preston started to hyperventilate, tugging frantically at the collar of his cashmere sweater as he muttered to himself about offshore accounts and SEC regulations. Jasmine was screaming at him, demanding to know how they were going to pay the lease on their luxury cars. Beatrice was crying out to Jesus, begging for a miracle that was never going to come. Harold just sat there. The proud, arrogant deacon who had spent his entire life looking down on me was completely paralyzed. He stared at the $500 consolation check he had handed me earlier in the evening. It sat on the table, a pathetic monument to his own arrogance. I did not raise my voice to speak over their screaming. I did not shed a single tear. I calmly reached into my tote bag one final time. I pulled out 2 heavy manila envelopes and tossed them onto the center of the table, right on top of the catering invoice. The first envelope contains a formal 30-day eviction notice for this property. I announced, cutting through their panic with cold, hard logistics. You have until the end of January to pack up your country club memories and vacate my house. If you damage the property or attempt to steal the fixtures, I will have you arrested for vandalism. I pointed to the second envelope. That one is a formal cease and desist order for Preston and Jasmine. If either of you attempt to contact me, my firm, or my holding company for a bailout, I will hand the unredacted forensic audit directly to the Department of Justice tomorrow morning. You will handle your own federal fraud charges without my money. I buttoned my designer coat, smoothing the luxurious wool lapels. I picked up my tote bag and slung it comfortably over my shoulder. I looked at the feast my mother had prepared, the fine crystal, and the terrified broken people sitting around it. I left the $500 check and the restaurant gift card sitting right next to the eviction notice. Use that to buy some packing boxes, I said. You are going to need them. I turned my back on my family and walked out of the dining room. I did not look back when Jasmine screamed my name. I did not pause when my mother wailed. I walked out the front door and stepped into the crisp, cold Christmas Eve air. My chauffeur was waiting beside my black Maybach. He opened the rear door for me with a respectful nod. I slid into the plush leather seat and let the warmth of the car surround me. As we drove away from the sprawling estate I owned, I looked out the tinted window and felt nothing but absolute total peace. 6 months later, my life was unrecognizable from the shadow I used to live in. I was running Granddaddy Earl's logistics empire alongside my cybersecurity firm, expanding our contracts globally. I was surrounded by a chosen family of brilliant mentors, fiercely loyal friends, and a team that respected my vision. The karma I left behind was swift and brutal. Preston and Jasmine were indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement. Their matching Mercedes were repossessed right out of their driveway in front of all their high society neighbors. Harold and Beatrice were evicted from my property right on schedule. Stripped of their wealth and their prestigious reputation, they were forced to downsize to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment miles away from their beloved country club. The church congregation they spent decades trying to impress quickly distanced themselves, wanting nothing to do with the scandal. I learned the greatest lesson of my life that Christmas Eve. Family is not defined by blood. It is defined by who treats you with respect, who honors your worth, and who stands by you when it counts. And when toxic people try to leave you out in the cold, you do not stand at the door begging to come inside. You buy the building and you change the locks. Jasmine slammed her hands down onto the polished mahogany table with such force that the fine china rattled and a crystal water glass tipped over, spilling a dark stain across the pristine white linen. She did not even blink at the mess. She was staring at the black velvet box resting under my fingertips, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. Real tears were finally falling down her face. They were not the calculated, delicate tears she used to manipulate our parents when she wanted a new car or a lavish vacation. These were hot, desperate, terrified tears of a woman watching the walls of her perfectly curated reality collapse inward. Her expensive mascara ran down her cheeks in dark streaks, ruining her flawless aesthetic. "You think a little velvet box changes anything?" she screamed, her voice breaking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. "None of this matters, Kendra. You are wasting your breath. You are just trying to scare us because you know you lost." She reached out and gripped Preston by the arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the sleeve of his cashmere sweater, as if his physical presence could shield her from the truth I had just exposed. Preston looked pale and sick, but Jasmine was determined to drag him back into the delusion. She needed the illusion to survive. She needed the golden couple narrative to remain intact. "Granddaddy Earl's millions clear probate tomorrow morning," she declared, her voice vibrating with a frantic, unhinged energy. "At exactly 9 o'clock tomorrow, the bank releases the holds on the entire family trust. We have the routing numbers. We have the official authorizations." The estate lawyer sat right in this very room after the funeral and walked us through the entire disbursement schedule. The commercial properties, the liquid assets, the logistics company. It all goes into the trust that Mom and Dad control. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, completely abandoning her high society poise. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "We are going to use that money to pay off the venture capital firm," she shouted, laying out her criminal survival plan for the whole room to hear. "We are going to wire the funds directly to the investors before the market even opens on Monday. The audit will be completely dropped. There will be no federal wire fraud charges because there will be no outstanding debt. We will make them whole, and they will disappear." Beatrice sat up straighter in her chair. The sheer panic that had gripped her just moments before began to recede, replaced by a desperate, aggressive spark of hope. My mother clung to Jasmine's logic like a drowning woman catching a life raft. She smoothed her silk dress and wiped her own tears, desperately trying to rebuild her pious facade. "Your sister is absolutely right," my mother stated, her voice trembling, but growing louder with every word. "Your grandfather built a massive empire from the ground up, and he left it to us to manage. He left it to the family trust. The exact same trust your father and I control. The exact same trust we just legally and formally removed your name from tonight." My mother pressed a hand to her pearl necklace, weaponizing her faith the way she always did when she needed to justify her own greed. "God provides for the righteous, Kendra," she proclaimed. "He provided a way out for this family. Your grandfather knew who truly respected the family name. He knew Preston had the vision to take this wealth to the next level. The Lord will not let you destroy this family with your bitter jealousy." Preston suddenly shifted in his seat. The color slowly began to return to his face as he latched onto the lifeline my mother and sister were throwing him. The terrified corporate fraud was instantly replaced by the arrogant tech bro who believed he was untouchable. He ran a hand through his hair and sat up, adjusting his posture to look authoritative. "It is a standard bridge maneuver," Preston babbled, trying to sound like a brilliant CEO executing a complex financial strategy instead of a thief plotting to launder money. "I can have my attorneys draft a promissory note against the estate tonight. We collateralize the logistics company to cover the $4 million. The SEC will not even open a file if the capital is replaced before the quarterly reports are filed. It is perfectly legal corporate restructuring." I sat perfectly still, listening to them openly conspire to commit massive financial crimes right in the middle of Christmas Eve dinner. They were planning to drain generational wealth built by a hardworking black man to cover the gambling debts of a white corporate con artist, and they were congratulating themselves for being brilliant enough to think of it. Jasmine glared at me, her breathing ragged, but her eyes burning with pure malice. "You tried to ruin us, Kendra," she sneered, leaning over the table. "You sat in your little office tracking my purchases, tracking our cars, trying to build a cage to lock us in. But you forgot exactly who you were dealing with. We have the family fortune. We will buy this house back from you at double the market value just to get your name off the deed and get you out of our lives forever. You thought you won because you bought some bank debt, but Mom and Dad just cut you out. You are getting absolutely nothing." They had built a massive house of cards right in front of my eyes. I let them stack every single delusion. I let them spell out exactly how they planned to steal my grandfather's legacy. Harold was the only person at the table who was not speaking. My father stared at the black velvet box resting under my hand. He was a man who understood the ruthless nature of business, and he knew that I would never have walked into his house and revealed my hand unless I already owned the entire board. The silence radiating from him was heavy and terrified. I looked at my mother, who was now nodding along with Jasmine, her posture proud and defiant. I looked at Preston, who was already running numbers in his head, convinced he had found a magical loophole to escape federal prison. And finally, I looked at my sister, whose tear-stained face was twisted into a triumphant, arrogant smirk. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, my voice cutting through their frantic plotting like a surgical blade. Jasmine gritted her teeth, her hands curling into fists. "We are finished with you," she spat. "Pack up your fake little folders and get out of our house." "My house," I corrected her gently, my tone completely devoid of emotion. "And no, Jasmine, we are not quite finished yet." I let the silence hang for exactly 2 seconds before the laugh finally bubbled up from my chest. It was not a polite chuckle or a nervous sound. It was a genuine, loud, cold laugh that bounced off the crystal chandelier and filled every corner of the dining room. It was the sound of a woman who had spent 35 years being told she was a failure, finally watching her abusers willingly trap themselves in a burning building. Jasmine froze. Her mouth snapped shut, and the arrogant fire in her eyes was instantly extinguished by pure confusion. Preston stopped muttering his desperate financial calculations. Beatrice pressed her hand against her chest, as if the sound of my laughter physically pained her. Only Harold remained completely still, his eyes darting between my face and the designer tote bag sitting by my feet. He recognized the tone of a victor who had already swept the board. "You actually believe Granddaddy Earl was going to let you touch his money?" I asked, my voice echoing with dark amusement. "You genuinely think the man who built a generational logistics empire from a single delivery truck in the segregated South was going to hand the keys over to a man who bankrupted his own home to protect a white corporate thief?" I reached down into my bag one last time. My fingers brushed against the soft fabric of a sleek black velvet box. I pulled it out and placed it squarely in the center of the mahogany table. With a sharp flick of my wrist, I snapped the hinge open. The interior was lined with dark silk. Resting perfectly inside was a specialized military-grade encrypted flash drive alongside a thick folded stack of heavy cream-colored legal paper. I reached inside and pulled the documents out. The thick gold notary seals gleamed under the dining room lights, demanding everyone's absolute attention. I flattened the papers out and placed the encrypted flash drive precisely on top of the first page. Then I pressed my fingertips against the documents and slid the entire stack directly into the center of the table, right over a spilled stain of red wine. "Go ahead and read them, Dad," I instructed, my tone completely void of mercy. "Pick them up and look at the dates. Look at the watermarks. Look at the signatures." Harold did not move immediately. His breathing was shallow and uneven. He stared at the gold seals as if they were venomous snakes waiting to strike. He knew exactly what they were. He had spent his entire adult life desperately trying to gain control of my grandfather's wealth, and he recognized the official corporate letterhead of Earl's private holding company instantly. Beatrice grabbed my father's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. "Harold, what is that?" she demanded, her voice trembling violently. "What did she just put on the table? Tell her to take it back." He slowly reached out his hands, shaking so badly that the heavy paper rustled as he picked it up. He adjusted his glasses, bringing the first page closer to his face. I watched his eyes scan the bold black text at the top. I watched the exact moment his last remaining sliver of hope was utterly obliterated. "What does it say?" Preston asked, his voice cracking with desperation. "Harold, tell us it is a fake. Tell us we can still leverage the trust tomorrow morning." I did not wait for my father to find his voice. I took control of the narrative, ensuring every single detail was carved into their memories permanently. "Granddaddy Earl was a genius," I stated, pacing slowly behind my chair. "He played the long game better than anyone I have ever met. For the last 6 months of his life, he watched every single move you all made. He hired my forensic accounting firm, long before Preston ever came onto my radar. He paid me to quietly audit his own family because he suspected you were hiding massive financial failures behind your country club memberships and church donations." Jasmine shook her head wildly, tears flying from her cheeks. "No," she shrieked, her voice hoarse and broken. "The lawyers read us the will after the funeral. They sat in this exact room and told us the logistics company and the real estate portfolio were going into the family trust. Mom and Dad control that trust. We are getting that money tomorrow." I stopped pacing and locked eyes with my sister. "The lawyers read you exactly what Granddaddy Earl paid them to read you, Jasmine," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He knew you were all financially incompetent. He knew Preston was a grifter bleeding investor capital. He knew that if he left his liquid assets and his voting shares in your control, the three of you would bankrupt his entire life's work in less than 5 years." I pointed to the documents trembling in my father's hands. "He set up a decoy trust," I revealed, "destroying their final illusion." He funded it with just enough capital to cover the initial administrative fees and pay the estate lawyers to put on a good show for you. He specifically designed it to keep you comfortable and quiet while he handled his actual business. Beatrice let out a sharp, devastated gasp, covering her face with both hands, with both. 82 days before he passed away, I continued, my voice relentless and clear. Granddaddy Earl executed an ironclad, irrevocable legal transfer. He did not leave his empire to a will that could be contested in probate court. He bypassed the family trust entirely. Harold finally lowered the papers. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated defeat. His shoulders sagged, and he looked smaller, older, and completely broken. He transferred it all, Harold whispered, his voice nothing but a hollow rasp. The voting shares, the commercial real estate, the liquid capital. It is an immediate assignment of ownership. I pointed to the silver device resting on top of the legal papers. And just in case you try to call your lawyers to contest the mental capacity of a dying man, I suggest you look at that flash drive, I added. That is a continuous high-definition video of Granddaddy Earl, signing every single one of those transfers. He sat in his hospital bed with his primary care physician, a court-appointed psychiatrist, and 3 independent corporate attorneys. They evaluated him on camera. They asked him specific, detailed questions about his logistics empire and his financial state. He answered them flawlessly. He explicitly stated on video that he was deliberately bypassing his son Harold and his granddaughter Jasmine due to gross financial negligence and moral bankruptcy. Harold flinched as if I had physically struck him across the face. Moral bankruptcy, he repeated the words barely audible. That is what he called it, Dad. I confirmed without a single ounce of pity. He saw you leverage this house to pay off a corporate thief. He watched Mom steal from the church treasury to fund her high society wardrobe. He knew everything, and he made absolutely certain that his legacy would never be used to finance your fraud. The room was so quiet I could hear the wind rattling the dining room windows. The grand illusion of the perfect African-American family, the pristine country club facade, the righteous church-going image, it had all been meticulously dismantled piece by piece. Jasmine lowered her hands from her ears. Her face was red and blotchy, her expensive silk dress wrinkled and stained. But my inheritance, she whimpered, her voice regressing into the tone of a spoiled child who had just been told no for the very first time. I am his granddaughter. I am supposed to get my share. I looked at my sister, shaking my head slowly. You already got your share, Jasmine. You got a $250,000 wedding funded by fraud. You got Birkin bags paid for by stolen venture capital. You got matching Mercedes leases that are going to be repossessed on Monday. You took your inheritance in advance and you burned it all to the ground just to look rich on the internet. Preston looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wide with panic. Kendra, listen to me, he begged, his voice trembling. If you own the holding company, you have the liquidity. You can authorize a corporate loan, just a short-term bridge to cover my investors. I will sign whatever you want. I will give you equity in my company. I will pay you back with interest. Please, you cannot let me go to federal prison. I stared at the white man who had spent the entire evening talking down to me, insulting my career, and mocking my independence. He was now begging me for salvation. I would not give you a single dime if you were drowning. Preston, I stated, my voice perfectly cold. Your company is worthless. Your equity is toxic. And you are going to face the federal government entirely on your own. So, Preston collapsed back into his chair, sobbing into his hands. I turned away from him, disgusted by the sight of a man who was perfectly willing to let my family go bankrupt to save his own skin. My father was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling, as he stared at the flash drive resting on the table. He shook his head, refusing to accept the reality that his entire life had been a carefully managed lie. My father would never hand a multi-billion-dollar logistics company to a woman who has never moved a single shipping container, Harold argued, his voice cracking with desperate denial. It does not make logical sense, Kendra. I was his vice president. I was his right-hand man for 20 years. I knew the routes. I knew the suppliers. I am his only son. I looked at the man who had just tried to throw me out of my own house. You were a glorified paperweight, Dad, I stated, stripping away his final illusion of grandeur. Granddaddy Earl kept you in that corner office with a fancy title because putting you on the payroll was cheaper than letting you try to run your own business and dragging the family name through the mud. Harold opened his mouth to object, but I cut him off instantly. He knew you were financially incompetent, Dad. He knew it long before you took out that secret second mortgage. For the last 2 years of his life, Granddaddy Earl had my forensic accounting firm auditing the logistics company from top to bottom. He wanted to see exactly what would happen to his empire if he left you in charge. Do you want to know what my team found? My mother covered her ears as if she could physically block out the words, but I projected my voice so there was no escaping the truth. We found that every single time Granddaddy Earl let you make an executive decision, the company lost money, I said, pacing slowly around the dining room table. We found the bad vendor contracts you signed just so you could look like a big shot at the country club. We found the bloated expense accounts you approved for your golf buddies. Granddaddy Earl looked at those audit reports, and he realized that if he left you the keys to the castle, you would crash it into a wall before his headstone was even engraved. Harold gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his jaw trembling as decades of unearned pride completely evaporated. And he saw right through your husband too, Jasmine, I said, pivoting to my sister, who was curled in her chair, looking like a terrified child. You thought Granddaddy Earl was just a sweet old man you could manipulate with Sunday visits and fake smiles. But he was a self-made millionaire who survived the Jim Crow South by reading people faster than they could read him. Jasmine refused to look up. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her diamond bracelet catching the light from the chandelier. He knew Preston was a fraud the very first time you brought him to a family cookout, I revealed. Preston tried to pitch his little app startup to Granddaddy Earl over a plate of ribs. He threw around all his empty Silicon Valley buzzwords, hoping to secure a seed investment from the old man. But Granddaddy Earl did not give him a dime. Do you know why, Jasmine? Because he ran a background check on your brilliant husband. He saw the undisclosed lawsuit. He saw the stolen source code. He called Preston a smooth-talking parasite who was going to drain you dry. Preston did not even lift his head. He just sat there shivering in his expensive cashmere, completely exposed as the thief he truly was. That is why Granddaddy Earl made the transfer, I declared, my voice ringing with absolute finality. He sat in his hospital room reading the final audit reports, and he knew he had to protect his legacy from his own blood. He executed an ironclad legal transfer of 100% of the voting shares, the commercial real estate portfolio, and all liquid assets directly to my holding company. He completely bypassed the probate courts. He bypassed the estate lawyers. He bypassed you. Beatrice let out a low, agonizing moan. She rocked back and forth in her chair, her perfectly styled hair beginning to fray at the edges. But we are his family, she wailed, her voice thick with panic and grief. We are his church-going, God-fearing family. He would not just leave us with nothing. He would not leave his only daughter-in-law out in the cold. I stopped pacing and stood directly at the head of the table, commanding the room. He did not leave you out in the cold, Mom, I said, my tone dropping to a chilling level of calm. He left you exactly what you earned. You spent 35 years prioritizing status over substance. You worshipped a white con artist while treating your own black daughter like a charity case. You sat at this table tonight and tried to cut me out of my own legacy because I refused to be a pawn in your toxic country club games. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the mahogany table right next to the glowing silver flash drive. Granddaddy Earl gave me the empire because I am the only person in this family who knows how to protect it, I said. He transferred the liquid assets to me because he knew I would never let someone like Preston gamble it away. He gave me the voting shares because he knew I had the spine to look my own parents in the eye and tell them no. Harold looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a terrifying mixture of hatred and absolute defeat. You planned this, he choked out. You sat there all these months, knowing you held the deed to this house, knowing you controlled the company, and you let us believe we were in charge. You let us humiliate you tonight, just so you could pull the rug out from under us. I did not let you do anything, Dad, I corrected him smoothly. You chose to humiliate me. You chose to slide a pathetic $500 check across this table to insult me. You chose to announce my disinheritance on Christmas Eve to make yourselves feel powerful. I just gave you enough rope to hang yourselves, and you tied the knot perfectly. The silence that followed was absolute. There were no more threats of calling the police. There were no more arrogant business lectures from Preston. There was no more fake Christian posturing from my mother. There was only the suffocating reality that their pristine upper-class existence was completely gone. I picked up the black velvet box and placed the encrypted flash drive safely back inside. I snapped the lid shut. The sharp click echoed like a judge's gavel signaling the end of the trial. I had dismantled their lies, exposed their fraud, and legally secured my empire. There was only one final truth left to deliver, and it was going to ensure they never slept peacefully in my house ever again. I slid the thick stack of original trust documents back toward the center of the table. Jasmine was staring at them as if they were written in a foreign language. Her eyes kept darting back to her designer clutch, where she had tucked her copy of the paperwork the lawyers had handed her after the funeral. She was desperately trying to reconcile the fantasy in her head with the nightmare sitting right in front of her. She finally spoke, her voice trembling so badly it sounded like she was shivering in the freezing cold. But the lawyers said there was a family trust. The document we signed tonight, the one cutting you out, it has to mean something. There has to be money left in the primary accounts. We saw the portfolio summaries last month. I looked at my sister, watching the final stages of her delusion fight for survival. I shook my head slowly. You are not listening to me, Jasmine. Granddaddy Earl was a master at supply chain logistics. He built his fortune by knowing exactly how to route valuable cargo while leaving a decoy truck on the highway to distract the hijackers. That is what you are holding in your clutch right now. A decoy. I turned my attention to my parents. Harold was staring blindly at his empty dinner plate, his jaw slack. Beatrice was clutching her chest, taking short, ragged breaths as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Let us talk about that family trust you are so proud of, Mom, I said, keeping my voice steady and educational as if I were conducting a seminar for failing students. Let us talk about the majestic document you gathered everyone around this table to celebrate tonight. The family trust is legally sound, I explained, pacing slowly behind my chair. The account exists. The routing numbers the lawyers gave you are entirely real. The paperwork you signed to formally disinherit me is legally binding. You did a fantastic job executing the paperwork. You crossed every T and dotted every I. Preston lifted his head, a microscopic spark of hope lighting up his bloodshot eyes. So there is capital, he croaked, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his forehead. If the trust is real, the bank has to honor the drafts. We can still wire the funds to the investors. We just need to execute a transfer authorization first thing in the morning. I let out a sharp sigh of profound disappointment. Preston, you are without a doubt the worst chief financial officer I have ever encountered in my professional career. A trust is just an empty bucket until someone pours water into it. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen and opened my secure banking application. Using my biometric clearance, I navigated directly to the executive overview of Granddaddy Earl's corporate holding company, the company I now owned in its entirety. I tapped a few menus and pulled up the exact financial profile they were banking their entire existence on. I took the liberty of checking the exact balance of the family trust account right before I walked through the front doors of my house tonight, I said, tapping the glass screen. I turned the phone around and slid it across the mahogany table so it rested directly in front of my mother. Read the balance, Mom. Read it out loud for your visionary son-in-law. Beatrice leaned forward, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the edges of the phone. She squinted at the bright screen. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She just let out a wet, strangled gasp, dropping the phone as if it had burned her skin. Read it, I commanded, projecting my voice so it commanded absolute obedience. 400, she whispered, her voice cracking into a high-pitched sob. $412. Jasmine shrieked, pushing her chair back violently. What? No. No, that is impossible. The estate is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You are lying. You altered the app. The estate is worth hundreds of millions, I corrected her coldly. The family trust is worth $412.63. Granddaddy Earl drained the primary accounts 82 days ago when he transferred the empire to me. He left exactly enough spare change in that account to cover the monthly maintenance fees until the probate cleared. That is it. That is your entire inheritance. The absolute destruction of their reality was magnificent to witness. There were no more loopholes. There were no more bridge loans or clever venture capital maneuvers to hide behind. The golden couple was completely and utterly bankrupt. My parents were financially ruined and about to be homeless. And the most beautiful part of it all was that they had done it entirely to themselves. Harold finally looked up at me, his eyes hollowed out, devoid of the arrogant pride that had fueled his entire existence. Why did he not just tell us? Harold asked, his voice completely broken, stripped of all its commanding baritone. Why let us believe we had the company? Why let us sit here planning the future of the estate? Because he wanted to see if you would do the right thing when you thought you had all the power. I answered, refusing to offer him a single ounce of sympathy. He wanted to see if you would protect your family, or if you would try to hoard the wealth for yourselves. He gave you a test, Dad, and tonight you gave him his answer from beyond the grave. I pointed to the consolation envelope sitting next to my plate. The insulting $500 check and the cheap chain restaurant gift card they had tried to degrade me with. You brought me to this table tonight to humiliate me, I said, my voice dropping an octave, carrying the weight of 35 years of disrespect. You sat there eating honey-baked ham and drinking expensive wine, gloating about how you were cutting the dead weight out of the family. You thought you were stripping me of my legacy because I refused to shrink myself down to fit your toxic country club aesthetic. You wanted to make me feel small. I walked back around the table and stood directly behind my own chair, looking down at the terrified, broken people who had made my life a living hell. You planned this whole Christmas Eve ambush to show me that I meant nothing to this family, I declared. But all you did was sign legally binding documents confirming that you have absolutely no claim to my assets. You signed away your right to contest the estate. You legally documented your own disinheritance. I looked directly into my mother's tear-streaked face. Her perfect makeup was ruined, her pristine image shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. I let my posture relax, exuding the absolute, unshakable authority of a woman who had just conquered her abusers. You didn't cut me out of the will, Mom, I said, delivering the final crushing blow. The absolute silence in the dining room shattered the moment the reality of my words fully registered. Complete pandemonium erupted, transforming the pristine holiday dinner into a scene of absolute humiliating chaos. Preston scrambled forward. He lunged across the table, knocking over his expensive crystal wine glass. A dark red stain bled across the white linen, but he did not even notice. The arrogant, condescending tech executive was gone, replaced by a desperate, sweating man staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. "Kendra, wait," Preston stammered, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "We can work this out. I have intellectual property. I have proprietary algorithms. You can absorb my startup into your holding company. We can rebrand the entire architecture. Just sign a bridge loan to cover the venture debt. I will give you 80% equity. 90%. You take total control of the board. Just please do not let the feds take me away." I looked at his shaking, manicured hands. "Your code is absolute garbage, Preston," I said, my voice sharp and devoid of a single ounce of pity. "I would not buy your fraudulent company for $1. You have exactly zero leverage. The Securities and Exchange Commission is going to dissect your entire life, and I am not spending 1 cent of Granddaddy Earl's hard-earned money to bail out a thief." Jasmine threw herself out of her chair. She rounded the table and practically collapsed at my feet, the heavy silk of her emerald gown pooling on the hardwood floor. The smug, entitled socialite vanished. She manufactured a fresh wave of tears, reaching out with trembling hands to grab my arm. "Kendra, please," she sobbed, tilting her face up to look at me with wide, pleading eyes. "I am your little sister. We grew up together. You cannot do this to me. I will lose my friends. I will lose my home. They are going to take my cars and my bags. How am I supposed to live? You have so much power now. Just pay off the debt. Please be the bigger person. Family protects family. You are the older sister, you are supposed to protect me. I took a deliberate step backward, forcing her hands to fall away from my coat. You did not care about family when you slid that $2,000 catering bill onto my plate, Jasmine. You did not care about family when you laughed at my career and told me I was just taking up space. You made your bed with stolen money. Now you get to sleep in it. Beatrice stood up. She straightened her posture, desperately attempting to summon the righteous, unassailable authority she wielded every Sunday morning in the front pew. She smoothed her dress and looked at me, her eyes wide with forced piety. Kendra, she said, her voice shaking with heavy religious manipulation. The Lord commands us to forgive. Matthew chapter 18 says, "If we do not forgive others their trespasses, our Father will not forgive ours." We are Christians. We operate with grace. You cannot turn your back on your own flesh and blood and leave us to the wolves. Vengeance belongs to the Lord, not to you. I stared at the woman who had spent 35 years trying to break my spirit, who had spent this very evening mocking my life choices and attempting to strip me of my legacy. God is forgiving, Mom. I stated, my tone dropping to a chilling level of calm. I am a forensic accountant. And right now, the math simply does not work in your favor. You used scripture to justify your vanity, and now you are trying to use it to excuse federal fraud. Save your sermons for the bankruptcy judge, because I am completely immune to your guilt trips. I turned away from her stunned, pale face. I reached into my designer tote bag one final time. I pulled out 2 heavy manila envelopes and tossed them onto the center of the table. They landed right on top of the ruined catering invoice and the pathetic $500 consolation check my father had offered me earlier. The first envelope contains a formal 30-day eviction notice for this property. I announced, my voice slicing through their hysterics with cold, hard logistics. You have until the end of January to pack up your country club memories and vacate my house. If you damage the property, if you punch holes in the walls, or if you attempt to steal the fixtures on your way out, I will have you arrested for vandalism. Harold slumped down into his chair, covering his face with his hands. He let out a low, defeated groan, the sound of a proud man who had finally been broken by the weight of his own arrogance. I pointed to the second manila envelope, keeping my eyes locked on Preston and Jasmine. That one is a formal cease and desist order, I declared. If either of you attempt to contact me, my firm, or my holding company for a financial bailout, I will hand the unredacted forensic audit directly to the Department of Justice tomorrow morning. You will not text me. You will not call me. You will handle your own federal fraud charges without my money and without my name. I stood up slowly, pushing my heavy dining chair back. The wooden legs scraped against the imported rug, creating a harsh grating noise that finalized the end of the negotiation. I did not rush. I did not storm off in a fit of uncontrollable rage. I moved with the deliberate, unhurried grace of an executioner who had just finished a long, grueling shift. I reached for my tailored black cashmere coat draped over the back of my chair. I slipped my arms into the silk-lined sleeves, pulling the heavy, warm fabric around my shoulders. I fastened the large horn buttons one by one. Each click of a button snapping into place felt like a vault door locking, shutting out 35 years of emotional manipulation, conditional love, and relentless disrespect. I was shedding the role of the dutiful punching bag and fully stepping into the authority of the woman who owned the ground they stood on. Jasmine was still weeping loudly, her face buried in her hands as her luxury facade dissolved into pure terror. Preston was muttering incoherently about legal loopholes that did not exist, his tech bro arrogance completely eradicated. My mother was rocking back and forth, clutching her chest, while my father remained entirely catatonic, staring blankly at the polished wood. They were completely engulfed in the flames of their own making. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice to yell over their pathetic chorus of despair. I was a fortress of absolute ice. I reached down and picked up my designer tote bag, securing the leather strap comfortably on my shoulder. Then I looked down at the center of the mahogany table. Right next to the formal eviction notice and the federal cease and desist order sat the plain white envelope they had so arrogantly handed me just an hour ago. I reached out and tapped my manicured fingernail against the $500 personal check and the $50 chain restaurant gift card. "Keep these," I instructed, my voice cutting through their sobbing with razor-sharp clarity. "You are going to need every single dollar to buy heavy-duty packing boxes. Moving out of a luxury estate on short notice is incredibly expensive, especially when your credit accounts are frozen. I suggest you start packing the guest rooms tonight." Harold flinched at the sound of my voice, but he still refused to look up. Beatrice let out another loud, agonizing wail, pressing her face into the tablecloth. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not owe them a shred of empathy. They had spent my entire life teaching me that family is a strict business transaction, and tonight, I simply closed the account for good. I turned my back on the dining room and began the long walk toward the front door. The rhythmic click of my heels against the polished hardwood floors echoed down the grand hallway. I did not look back. I did not hesitate. I walked past the massive floor-to-ceiling mirrors and the expensive oil paintings they had purchased to impress their country club friends. I walked past the gallery wall of framed family photographs perfectly arranged in the foyer. I stopped for a fraction of a second to look at the portraits of Jasmine in her custom wedding dress, the photos of Preston posing with my father on the golf course, and the perfectly staged holiday pictures that I was intentionally excluded from year after year. I looked at those golden frames and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of satisfaction, knowing I would have my commercial cleanup crew toss every single one of them into a dumpster by the end of January. The history they tried to write without me was about to be erased entirely. I reached the heavy, solid oak front door. I gripped the cold brass handle and pulled it wide open. The crisp, freezing Christmas Eve air hit my face instantly. It was a sharp, biting cold that felt absolutely magnificent against my skin. The atmosphere inside the dining room had been thick with the suffocating stench of greed, fear, and broken pride. Stepping out onto the grand stone porch felt like drawing my very first breath of pure, uncontaminated oxygen. I walked down the wide brick steps of the house I now legally owned. The sprawling front lawn was perfectly manicured, illuminated by tasteful, warm holiday uplighting that cast long shadows across the frost-covered grass. And waiting right at the bottom of the circular driveway, idling smoothly and silently in the quiet winter night, was my sleek, black Maybach. My private chauffeur, Winston, stood perfectly straight beside the rear passenger door. He wore a sharp black suit and maintained a neutral, highly professional expression. As I approached, he opened the heavy armored door for me, bowing his head slightly, in a gesture of absolute respect. It was the kind of respect I had to buy my way into because the people who shared my blood vehemently refused to give it to me for free. "Good evening," Ms. Kendra, Winston said, his voice smooth and steady. "I trust the dinner was satisfactory." "It was extremely productive, Winston," I replied, offering him a genuine warm smile. "Please take me home." I stepped into the spacious, luxurious interior of the Maybach. I sank back into the buttery, soft, heated leather seats, letting my muscles finally relax. The ambient cabin lighting cast a gentle, calming purple glow around me. The air smelled of expensive new leather and subtle vanilla, completely erasing the lingering scent of the holiday ham and my mother's suffocating floral perfume. Winston closed the heavy door, sealing me inside the soundproof cabin. The frantic, muffled sounds of my family's ruined the house. The neighborhood, the entire toxic ecosystem I had just dismantled, were instantly cut off. They were replaced by absolute total silence. I looked out the tinted passenger window as the vehicle smoothly accelerated down the long, winding driveway. I watched the massive colonial estate fade into the distance. The house that had served as my childhood prison was now nothing more than a highly leveraged real estate asset listed on my corporate balance sheet. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel any lingering trauma pulling me back toward the front door. I felt a radical, unshakable peace settling deep into my bones. They tried to leave me out in the cold on Christmas Eve with absolutely nothing. Instead, I was riding away in a $500,000 car, leaving them to freeze in the exact same storm they tried to push me into. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and sent a quick text message to my lead property manager, scheduling the lock change for the first day of February. I locked the screen, dropped the phone into my bag, and leaned my head back against the plush headrest, closing my eyes as the car carried me back to the empire I built with my own two hands. 6 months later, the heavy, humid heat of late June settled over the city, but inside the executive boardroom of my logistics empire, the air was perfectly cool and crisp. I sat at the head of a massive slate conference table, reviewing the quarterly projections for the company. Granddaddy Earl's logistics firm was not just surviving under my leadership, it was exponentially expanding. I had successfully integrated my cybersecurity firm with his supply chain infrastructure, creating an impenetrable corporate network that was currently securing contracts with the federal government. My grandfather trusted me with his legacy, and I multiplied it. I closed the financial portfolio and looked out the floor-to-ceiling glass windows at the sprawling city skyline. My phone vibrated with a message from my lead director confirming the catering order for the dinner party I was hosting that evening. I was not hosting it at the old colonial estate. I had sold that property to a commercial developer back in March, erasing the physical monument of my childhood trauma completely. Instead, I was hosting it at my newly purchased penthouse downtown. The people gathering around my dining table tonight were not tied to me by blood. They were my chosen family. They were the brilliant mentors who guided me through my early career, the fierce friends who let me sleep on their couches when my parents first cut me off, and the loyal colleagues who helped me build my forensic firm from a single laptop into a powerhouse. We were going to eat incredible food, laugh until our ribs ached, and celebrate each other's victories without a single ounce of jealousy or conditional love. There would be no gaslighting, no passive-aggressive gift cards, and absolutely no catering invoices dropped on anyone's plate. While I was busy elevating my empire, the karma I left behind on Christmas Eve had executed its work with ruthless, absolute precision. The venture capital investors did exactly what I said they would do. On the Monday morning following our holiday dinner, they pulled every single cent of their backing from Preston's fraudulent startup. I handed my firm's unredacted forensic audit directly over to the Department of Justice. The federal authorities did not play games with wire fraud. By the middle of January, federal agents had raided Preston's leased office space, confiscating servers, hard drives, and financial records. Preston and Jasmine are currently facing a mountain of federal charges for embezzlement, wire fraud, and corporate conspiracy. The luxury lifestyle Jasmine thought made her superior evaporated overnight. Those matching Mercedes coupes she loved to flaunt were repossessed right out of their driveway in broad daylight, while all their high society neighbors watched from their manicured lawns. The bank seized her limited edition designer bags, her diamond bracelets, and the overseas bank accounts as part of a massive asset forfeiture sweep. Preston is looking at a substantial federal prison sentence, and because they completely drained their accounts to fund their fake aesthetic, they cannot even afford private legal counsel. The golden couple is currently trading in their silk and cashmere for court-mandated appearances alongside an overworked public defender. My parents' fate was equally poetic. I upheld the formal 30-day eviction notice without a single second of hesitation. On the first day of February, the property management company I hired arrived with a locksmith and a sheriff deputy to oversee their departure. Harold and Beatrice were legally forced to pack up decades of manufactured prestige and squeeze their entire lives into a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the other side of town. The social fallout was spectacular. The prestigious country club my mother based her entire identity around immediately revoked their membership, citing a strict morals clause triggered by the highly public scandal of their son-in-laws, federal crimes, and their own defaulted mortgage. The church congregation they spent 35 years trying to impress completely turned their backs on them. Nobody in the high society circles they worshipped wanted to associate with a disgraced deacon and his financially ruined wife. They became absolute pariahs in the very community they had sacrificed me to impress. Now they get to sit in an apartment with paper-thin walls staring at each other and thinking about the empire they proudly threw away just to protect a lie. I used to spend my life wondering why I was never good enough for their table. I used to exhaust myself trying to prove my worth to people who were committed to misunderstanding my value. I thought surviving my family meant learning how to endure their disrespect in silence. But sitting in my penthouse surrounded by people who honor my presence, I realized the absolute truth about survival and success. I did not just survive my family, I completely outgrew them. Family isn't blood, it is who treats you with respect. And when toxic people try to leave you out in the cold, you don't beg to come inside, you buy the building and change the locks. The greatest lesson I learned is that your worth is never defined by people committed to misunderstanding you, even if they share your blood. For years, I allowed toxic family expectations to dictate my value, hoping my hard work would finally earn their respect. But true power comes from walking away from tables where you are secretly the menu. Financial independence and unshakable boundaries are your absolute best armor against manipulation. Blood might make you relatives, but mutual respect, loyalty, and genuine support make you family. Never shrink yourself to fit their broken narrative. Build your own empire instead. If you have ever had to cut off toxic relatives to protect your peace and secure your success, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop your story in the comments below.